In the Hebrew Bible, there's a book very near the end called, in English, Chronicles. It's actually a retelling of the earlier books in the Bible, but from a new perspective. In the book of Kings, you have basically a monarchic, a king's court perspective on the history of the kingdom of Israel in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south, which we'll be getting into in later classes. But it's a monarchic perspective. So the kings are the heroes, or occasionally the villains, and the priests are sort of in the background. The book of Chronicles, which appears at the very end of the Hebrew Bible, also called the Tanakh, is a priestly view of Jewish history. And surprise, surprise, when the priests tell the story, guess who the most important characters are over and over again? It's the priests. They become much more important characters than they were in earlier versions of the history that appear in what's sometimes called the Deuteronomic history, because it has a similar philosophy of life to the book of Deuteronomy. Well, now what's interesting for us is not which is more accurate, the book of Kings or the book of Chronicles. It is interesting, though, that the book of Chronicles appears at the end of the Hebrew Bible canonization process, so it's maybe written somewhat later than the book of Kings. You might use that as a basis to evaluate which is more reliable. But what I'm interested in now is actually the title of the book, because the title of the book in Hebrew is not Chronicles. It literally is in Hebrew, Divrei Hayamim, which means the things of the days. Devarim are things or words, and Yamim is days, like Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. So Divrei Hayamim, the words of the days. And in some ways, that phrasing is relevant for why humanistic Jews study Jewish history in the first place. In most Jewish settings, certainly in more religious Jewish settings, you often will begin a board meeting, a conversation with something called a Devar Torah, which is a word of Torah, a word of wisdom. It's almost always connected back to the Hebrew Bible, specifically the first 5 books, the Torah in Jewish life. And it could be from the Torah portion of the week, most often, occasionally somewhere else. And they try to connect whatever the board meeting topic is or whatever the other program topic is to the Torah portion for the week. It's a rabbinic art form, of how to take the Torah portion of the week on leprosy and make it relevant for a board meeting on the budget or whatever the challenge is. But what I find interesting in thinking about Jewish history from a humanistic perspective is that in some ways, the Divrei Hayamim, the words of the days, are our kind of Divrei Torah. We want to learn not just from Jewish literature or from the first 5 books of Jewish literature. We want to learn from the literature of the Jewish experience, what actually happened, and not just ending with Moses looking over the promised land and dying, which is what happens at the end of Deuteronomy. What happens after? What happens next? What really happened according to archaeology? What happened after the Bible is over and they begin the process of creating rabbinic literature? What's happening around the rabbis while they're writing down these teachings? Under what governments are they living? How are they earning a living? All kinds of interesting questions that historians ask that the rabbinic sources don't always ask. And so sometimes we're stuck in the realm of guessing. We don't have perfect evidence. We can't know absolutely for sure. It's not going to be as definitive as on 6 days God made the world and on 7 days he rested. We're not going to have that kind of exact day-by-day chronology. But in some ways, the mystery is almost more interesting. And it's a human story. You see, mythology is the story of the gods and what they do. But history is the story of human beings and what we do and what we've done and what we might do again going forward. So in many ways, for us, learning from Jewish history is our Dvar Torah. It's our studying of the Jewish experience to learn from it what happened, but also to learn from it what we might do in our own time. Now, there are some challenges to studying Jewish history. We have to sort of name these and sort of bracket them, knowing what we're dealing with here. The first is that history is a relatively recent phenomenon in Jewish life. The very concept of having a secular history without the gods running everything is beginning in the Greek period with Herodotus and Thucydides. It becomes more popular in the Renaissance. But for Jews, history was in some ways less relevant. It either was a repeat of the old patterns, So the prophets prophesied. So does this prophecy apply to today? Well, it's the old pattern of what the prophets prophesied about Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. Now it's applied to Rome. Now it's applied to the Russians. Now it's applied. Or else it's the never-ending cycle of suffering and reward and return. So the next persecutor is always called Amalek or Amalek. You know, Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainian peasant rebellion in 1654 or 1645, sorry, that was Amalek. Hitler, he's Amalek. Whatever's next is Amalek. It's just another repeat of the old pattern. It isn't that new. And so, in fact, when modern Israel created a Holocaust Memorial Day, the most Orthodox Jews in Israel don't celebrate it. They already have a disaster celebration day. It's called Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, when the first temple was destroyed and the second temple was destroyed and we were expelled from Spain and this happened and that happened and the other. That's the mourning day. We don't need a new day because, as Ecclesiastes said, there is nothing new under the sun. It all fits in the old traditional pattern. And honestly, for most rabbis throughout the Middle Ages into the early modern period, where Jews lived didn't matter. I mentioned this quote in one of my high holiday sermons. At the end of the movie Fiddler on the Roof, when they've been expelled from Anatevka, one man asks the rabbi, "Rabbi, we've been waiting for the Messiah all our lives. Wouldn't now be a good time?" And the rabbi says, "We'll just wait for him somewhere else." That's what Jewish history was. From a traditional theological, historical perspective, Jewish history is intermission. We're just waiting. Because real history was when there was a temple in Jerusalem and the divine presence lived there and we offered the sacrifices and then it was destroyed and we're in galut, in exile, and we're wandering, but it doesn't really matter where we wander because real history starts again when we return. If you look carefully at the text in the second half of the Passover Haggadah, and if you've used a traditional one, most people skip parts of the second half or jump around when they know a melody or whatever. But if you read the text there, it's very clearly saying, rebuild the temple, bring us back to Israel, bimhera b'yaminu, soon in our days. I mean, even the song Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, soon in our day, return with the Messiah, son of David. So the goal is to get back to real history, which is the temple in Jerusalem and the Jews there. In the meantime, we're in intermission, so who cares where we live or how many of us live here or what business we do or what events happen? It's less relevant than keeping our focus, our eye on the ball, which is the return and the rebuilding. And that's why so much of traditional Jewish study was focused not on non-Jewish language and science and math in the Middle Ages. It was studying the Talmud, so you'd be ready to sacrifice the animals when and if the Messiah came and rebuilt the temple. That's why a priest couldn't intentionally get himself impure, because who knows, the Messiah might come any day, and then he has to be on duty. So history historically was not a primary focus of Jewish life. It really is only in the 19th century, a little bit in the Renaissance, but really taking off in the 19th century, where you get a new field of study founded by Jews called Wissenschaft des Judentums. You can guess by the name, it starts in Germany in the 18 teens. Wissenschaft means science or the field of knowledge. Wissen is to know. Des Judentums, the field of Jewish knowledge. We today might call it Jewish studies. And it really is these scholars beginning in the 19th century who begin to ask the questions of where did Jews live and for how long and what did they do for a living and what were the laws under which they lived and how successful were they and where did they move to? What were the circumstances? This takes off in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, with the founding of an Eastern European Jewish institution called YIVO, Yiddische Wissenschaftliche Organisation, I forget the whole name, which is a Yiddish language-based study program and institution to study the Eastern European Jewish experience. And there's a wonderful questionnaire that you can see an example of where they went around and asked communities, how long have you lived here? And how many people live here? Do you have any archives? Do you have any minutes of your board meetings from the Kehillah that ran the community? And how far back can we go to find out what really happened? And that's when Jews begin to start asking that question of what happened and when and how. Another thing that really sparks the interest in this, something we'll talk about a bit later, is a random discovery by a couple of British women tourists in Cairo, where they buy a piece of parchment in a bazaar, and it turns out it's from an old garbage dump. The garbage dump was in the back of a synagogue. Today we call it the Cairo Geniza. Now, Geniza is where you would put old prayer books and Torah scrolls that couldn't be used anymore, but because they had the holy name on them, you couldn't just throw them away. What began to happen in the Cairo Jewish community after a riot in the Middle Ages, when they tried to go bury the books, was they just kept collecting them. And then they started collecting anything that had any Hebrew on it, even if it wasn't a holy book. And what was fascinating about this is because paper and parchment was so expensive back then, people would often reuse papers for other things. So they might have written a Hebrew poem on one side and then used the back as an inventory sheet for their caravan they were sending out. Well, for historians, that's a diamond. That's fantastic. Personal letters to people, Maimonides' handwriting. I mean, this is wonderful. But the Jewish community in Cairo didn't care. It was the garbage dump. They just kept dumping stuff in there. More and more papers on top. So scholars trying to figure it out have to like mine down the layers to figure out what's old and what's new, because everything keeps falling over and it's just a garbage dump pile. But they never threw it out. And now it lives at the University of Cambridge and University of Pennsylvania and a few other places that got parts of the Geniza. It finally got shipped out and preserved so it wouldn't fall apart, and studied so we could really understand what happened. But again, it's an example of how unimportant that was to the medieval Jewish mindset. The days, the words of the days didn't matter to them. They were focused on other things. So we're not used to thinking about ourselves historically, and we're not used to focusing on history. And the last point is, some people aren't interested in what the historian has to provide. They want the story. There was a famous example of this, we'll talk about again a bit later, when a conservative rabbi in California had the temerity around Passover time to say to his congregation, well, we all know the Exodus didn't really happen the way it says in the Haggadah. What? What? Well, I mean, academic history suggests that that isn't the case, that the Haggadah is myth but not history. But the fact that he said it in the congregation, people don't want to hear that history. They want the history they think they know, and not the history that actually happened. There's a marvelous book on this, very poetically written, called Zachor, based on the commandment to remember, by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. If anybody wants to reference, I'm happy to pass it on. But it really is a great meditation on what the Jewish historian is doing that's very important, that most Jews don't want to hear for a variety of reasons. Okay, so that's challenge number one, is the very concept of history is somewhat foreign to Jewish culture. Challenge number two is what I call Jewish ego. There's a concept in traditional Jewish thought that the Jews are the chosen people, that history revolves around the Jews. If good things happen to them, it's because they were behaving well. If bad things happen, it was because they were sinning, and they, in effect, control history. If Nebuchadnezzar is going to win, it's because of what the Jews do, not because of what Nebuchadnezzar does. This isn't how real history works. The other thing that's odd about the chosen people, and it sometimes comes across in other areas, I majored in Jewish studies, but it wasn't until as an undergraduate, but it wasn't until my senior year when I took a class on the history of the ancient Near East, from Alexander to Muhammad, that I finally understood the context. Because we were focusing on Jewish history, and the Greeks would pop in and then disappear, and then the Romans would show up and disappear. I finally understood, oh, that's the Roman Empire. Oh, that's who Alexander the Great was and his generals and why. Like, I got the bigger picture here. But all too often when we learn Jewish history, we're focused on the Jews. And then other people are bit players showing up. When actually, on the scale of world history, the Jews are bit players compared to everybody else in many ways. And so it takes a while for us to get used to the fact that we're not the center of history at all time, and that outside history is not necessarily revolving around us. In fact, there may even be factors that do directly affect Jews, like the rise of anti-Semitism, that may have very little to do with what Jews are actually doing. They may have to do with economic circumstances, the function of anti-Semitism in Christian polemics against other Christians. I mean, there's all kinds of dynamics that make it much more complicated than just about us and things we do or don't do. Challenge number three, the process of re-education. Some people mentioned that they went to Hebrew schools and learned certain things or didn't learn certain things there. But sometimes when you want to learn the real history of the Jews, you have to sort of clear out the cobwebs or clarify what's history and what's story and what's sort of founding mythology. So most American Jews are not creationists. They don't believe Adam and Eve is history, right? They don't believe that Noah and a global flood is history. That's those young earth creationists. That's those kooks who try to put their books in the bookstore of the Grand Canyon gift shop. I mean, these are people that are not what we're trying to say here. I mean, the stories are important, but they're not history. So the question becomes, where do you draw the line where it stops being myth and starts being history? You draw it after Adam and Eve. Okay. You draw it after Noah. Okay. What about Abraham? What about Moses and the Exodus? What about King David and Solomon? What about the whole divided kingdom of the northern and southern kingdom of Israel and Judah? Maybe that's all made up too. This is the realm of scholarly debate. How much can we believe from the biblical narrative and how much is supported by the archaeological evidence? And where do you draw the lines? Because we don't only believe it just because it's in the Bible. That's not enough. But as they say, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. That is, just because you didn't find a phone book with an Abraham written in it doesn't mean there was no Abraham. On the other hand, if you find stories about Abraham that describe camels in the Middle East when they didn't have domesticated camels until centuries after Abraham supposedly lived, then you've got to account for that. Is the story being written later? Or is this just an anachronistic detail that's dropped in by a later editor or writer? Or, what's the context for when the book is being written? So you have to ask these questions differently. When our bar and bat mitzvah students celebrate those events, if they choose a Torah reading for their presentation, one of the questions I ask them is, who do you think wrote this? And when did they write it? And why did they write it? Those are important questions for human written documents. So we should be asking those questions of our earliest documents too, which means a kind of re-education process. I mentioned the example of the Haggadah already. One other example, because it comes up periodically, it actually came up recently with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was you saw a lot of stuff circulating on the internet saying, well, Jews don't really believe in an afterlife, which would be news to all the rabbis who wrote the traditional prayer book, who believed in an afterlife. They have a lot of discussions of what they call in Hebrew, ha'olam haba, the world to come, and techiyat hamitim, the resurrection of the dead. In fact, the third blessing in the daily standing prayer, the Amidah, is blessing God for resurrecting the dead. I mean, it's an advanced blessing. It's like a hopeful blessing, like reminding God, by the way, just in case you forgot, let's make sure to add this to the agenda at some point in the cosmic plan. But you need to do this because this is one thing you've promised to do. So there is clearly a Jewish belief in an afterlife. But beginning in the 19th century, a number of Jews decided that that was sort of primitive. And like the discussions in the Talmud about when the dead are resurrected, do they come up naked or do they have clothes on? I mean, do we really want to spend time debating that? No. So they decided that the afterlife is not really a Jewish thing, and they sort of de-emphasized it. And so now you've got a whole generation of Jews who don't believe in an afterlife and assume that no Jews believe in an afterlife. But the reality is historic Judaism did have an afterlife concept. I mean, even the Bible has something called Sheol, which is like a Greek Hades, shadowy underworld. It's not a Garden of Eden or a resurrection, but after all, the whole Christian idea of a Garden of Eden resurrection comes from Jewish sources. Read the book of Daniel, chapter 12, very clearly reflects a resurrection narrative. So do Jews believe in an afterlife or not? Well, it's true. Many Jews today don't. But that doesn't mean that no Jews ever did or that no Jews do even now. And so you have to sort of re-educate people to what they thought was true for all Jews, maybe true for some, but not for all. Fourth challenge. When you explore the history of Jewish religion, it gets tricky because people take it very personally. If you start changing what the Bible says about who is a monotheist and when and why and how, then people get a little bit nervous about that. For example, we assume the Torah is a monotheistic document because we've always been told that. But if you read the Ten Commandments carefully, one of them says, you will not have any other gods before me. Does that mean there are no other gods? Or that they simply have to sit in the back of the bus? Maybe it was in a context where you were moving from many gods to only worshiping one God who's a jealous God who doesn't want you to look at any other gods. But there are still other gods out there. So, maybe it's an evolution process instead of Abraham gets the word, he's pure monotheist all the way through. So this is, again, part of our challenge in the re-education process, but particularly when you talk about religion and God and gods, then it gets even more complicated. Are you really allowed to ask any question in Jewish life? Or are there maybe some questions that will get you thrown out of the house of study or called an apikoros, a heretic? I once had a debate with a Hebrew teacher when I was in Israel about whether it's possible to pluralize the word for Judaism in Hebrew. The word for Judaism in Hebrew is Yahadut, and I wanted to say Yahaduyot, which would grammatically be the plural of Judaisms. She said, can't do that. There's just Judaism, not Judaisms. I mean, today, 20 years later, she might think differently as the dialogue has gone on, but I think historically there were Judaisms, and today there are Judaisms. So this is part of our challenge in learning this history. A fifth challenge is that Jewish studies often gets political. Studying the early history of Israel, can you imagine how that might get political? Of who was here when and how did they get here and what happened to the people who were there first? And that the whole field of biblical archaeology has become very, very contentious historically. But also studying the history of secular Jewish communities in the 20s, 30s, and 50s in the United States has been overshadowed by the anti-communism of the 1950s forward, which crushed a number of very active left-wing Jewish organizations. There's now even a reevaluation of Franklin Roosevelt, who, to my grandparents' generation, was the hero beyond parallel. And now people are using criticism of Roosevelt and his indifference to Jews during the Holocaust as a club to try and club Jews away from the Democratic Party in a contemporary political dialogue. History becomes the field of argument and battle. What counts as anti-Semitism and what doesn't? Well, do we go back historically? One historian actually just recently published an op-ed saying we shouldn't even use the term anti-Semitism because of its origins and how it's not accurate for describing what we do today. After all, the Semites are a tribe. Arabic is a Semitic language, but any kind of semantic that would say you can't be anti-Semitic in Arabic, and from the Arab people doesn't make any sense because there are Arabs who are what we would call anti-Semitic. There are some who are not, but there are some who are. And to have a term used for Jew hatred that preempts certain people from qualifying doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it was coined in Europe in the 19th century. It doesn't mean we have to continue to use the same term. So this is part of our challenge in studying the history, is that there's politics involved at just about every period. And the last challenge we have is that it's what I call the black hole of the Holocaust. The reason why a black hole is a black hole is that it absorbs all light that goes into it, and it even bends light that goes around it. The Holocaust is like that. It's like a black hole that bends light so you can't even see around it to see what was before without knowing what comes next. There's a town in southwestern Poland that had a long Jewish history. It has an ancient synagogue that's recently been restored. It had a Hasidic dynasty that started there. The town in Polish is called Oswiecim. But Oswiecim, if you put it into German, is Auschwitz. And can you really study the history of Oswiecim, the Polish town, without hearing the echoes of Auschwitz when you're looking at it? I think it's almost impossible. So learning about the history of the Jews in Germany or in Poland or in Russia or in Salonika in Greece, which was a Sephardic Jewish community destroyed during the Holocaust, it's hard to read it without that sort of teleology of, but they're all going to die. And it's not fair to them. They didn't know that. They were living history forward, not backward. And so they didn't know what was coming, but we do. And that makes it harder to study those periods of history, knowing what's going to happen. Or go forward just a few years, the history of the Jews in Muslim lands, in North Africa, in Iraq, in Iran. There's almost no Jews left in any of those countries. They've all moved. Some to Israel, some to France, some to Montreal, some to the United States, but they're not there anymore. And it's not fair to tell their history as if it was going to end that way all the time. You have to let them live the history out the way it was going. So again, it's hard to get the present out of our minds to be able to talk about the past on fair terms, but it's something we have to try to do. So, in deciding to teach this class, I'm doing it chronologically. We're starting at the beginning and we're moving forward. But in theory, we could have done it differently. We could have done it topically, start with Jewish food. What did Jews eat then? What did Jews eat then? What did Jews eat then? And then Jewish religion in different periods, and just do it topically and then survey the periods differently. We could have done it geographically and talked about the land of Israel and what happened all the way through, and in Europe, what happened all the way through. But we decided to go chronological direction. And the last opening thing I wanted to share before asking for any questions and also looking over the discussion questions is what I talked about in the introductory essay that you'll receive either electronically or by paper. There are two parts to studying history. One is what happened, and the other is what does it mean? So when we look at what happened in Jewish history, traditionally, there was a relatively easy way to figure it out. Read the book. You want to know what happened in the biblical period? Read the book. You want to know, was there an Exodus? Read the book. Or read the commentaries on the book that help explain the book. In other words, the authorized traditional sources was the way you found out what happened. I remember once I was in a graduate class, we were studying the story of Lot and his daughters, which is after the destruction of the city of Sodom. Lot and his two virgin daughters wind up in a hillside. They think the whole world's been destroyed. So the daughters get him drunk and sleep with him and then become pregnant with the ancestors of the Ammonites and the Moabites. Nice kid story. In fact, it's probably not the origin story the Moabites and Ammonites told for themselves. This is sort of a political history that's projected back to say they're really bastards and sons of incest. But one interesting comment on that I noticed when I was reading Rashi's commentary on it to prepare for class was Rashi says, well, we all know that girls who have sex the first time can't get pregnant normally. But in this case, they held their pelvis in a certain way so they could get pregnant. Well, we know scientifically that's just not true. I even know someone who got pregnant the first time she had sex. Not by me. But the point is that Rashi was wrong. So I mentioned this in class, just as an interesting side comment. And someone in the class who'd gone to a Jewish day school said, oh, you must have misunderstood him. Rashi couldn't be wrong. Even on a point of science, Rashi could not be wrong. So I couldn't let that go. I had to photocopy the page from the Rashi commentary and bring it in and show everybody. And her next response was, why do you care so much? Let's move the goalpost here. But the reality is, traditionally, the traditional versions were the truth. And that's it. You want to know the answer? Read the book. Our version is very different. We want to know what really happened. And sometimes the book is an accurate source, but it's one source. And maybe there are other sources. For example, we have a description of a siege of Jerusalem under King Hezekiah around the year 701 BCE. We also have a description of that same siege from the Assyrian point of view, on a monument that they wrote about it. Now, needless to say, the versions are somewhat different. But the fact that both are describing an event around the same time period gives us much more confidence that it actually happened, even if, again, different people are going to have different perspectives. So again, Bible alone might not be enough, but Bible plus outside sources, plus in this particular case, there's also a burn layer over one of the towns that supposedly the Assyrians destroyed on the way to Jerusalem. Well, so now we have Bible source, outside written source, and archaeological evidence all supporting some kind of version of that event. Okay, so that's really our sort of, golden fleece here that we're looking for is confirmation, corroboration, and as best we can understand what really happened from many sources. And sometimes, by the way, we might know more about what happened 200 years before a particular period than the people who lived then, because we've done the archaeology. They were living on a mound, a tell. They didn't even know there was an old city there. Just to give you one example of this, in modern Israeli history, so there's a beautiful seaside town called Caesarea, which was sort of the Roman resort town. They didn't want to stay in Jerusalem that was hot and dusty and sandy, and Caesarea was the seaside resort where you wanted to be. And for many years, people thought that Josephus, who is an ancient Jewish historian, described the city wrong. He said there was an amphitheater, and then next to the amphitheater was a hippodrome, which is a long sort of oval track for chariot races and gladiators. But they didn't see the hippodrome, so they figured he just got it wrong, or he mixed it up with another town. It turns out the hippodrome was under the car parking lot. There was a big hill next to the Colosseum, and everyone parked their cars on it. It turns out the hippodrome was under that. So Josephus was right, but all the Israelis who were living there didn't realize it because they hadn't done the digging. The same is true for the ancient world. If they lived on a tell, a mountain that had been built by generations of settlements that destroyed and built on and destroyed and built, they didn't know what was under them. But we who do the archaeology might know more than they did. And that might mean we have to change our understanding of what actually happened. That's step one, is what happened. Step two is, what does it mean? Traditionally, again, Jewish history was proof of the chosen people story. History was an expression of theology. If things went well, we did right. If things went poorly, we did wrong. And it's almost a kind of blame the victim approach, because if the Babylonians show up and kill you, you must have done something to cause it to happen. Our approach is that our lesson from Jewish history, what does it mean, is that we need to rely on ourselves. We need to build up our skills. We sometimes need to defend ourselves, or we need to find safe places to move. That's how we survived. It wasn't the course of history that preserved the Jewish people. It was Jewish people that preserved the Jewish people over all those centuries, being stubborn and being creative and negotiating and moving and migrating and modifying who they were and what they did. That's how we made it. It wasn't because of any kindness of the fates or history working out to our benefit by its design. Rather, our version of the meaning of Jewish history is we have to do it, because otherwise history does not have our best interests at heart. So that's a quick overview of some of the challenges getting into Jewish history. And we do have some discussion questions we can look at as well in the next 10 or 15 minutes. But I wanted to stop here and ask if there are any questions or comments on what I talked about in this first period.
Can you describe who Rashi is, like when he lived? And
yes, sorry. Rashi's a medieval Jewish commentator who lived in France, sort of near the Rhine Valley, near the border between France and Germany, around the year 1000 of the Common Era. And he is treated as like the canonical commentator on the Bible and the Talmud. Most editions of the printed Talmud, a collection of Jewish law, will have Rashi's commentary as sort of a core piece you have to have there. And many versions of the Orthodox Hebrew Bibles will also have Rashi's commentary right there. He is often very good at clarifying and explaining what's going on in the text. He also has a wonderful mastery of rabbinic commentaries from other periods that he brings together in his commentary. So it's a nice sort of Reader's Digest collection. And sometimes he's wrong. Like occasionally, around this time period, Hebrew grammarians were learning that Hebrew grammar was like Arabic grammar, and that it had a three-letter root system. That the word, like the word shalom, is sh-l-m, and that same root shows up in a lot of different words. So lishalem is to pay, shlemut is perfection, and shalom is peace or wholeness. And the same is true salam in Arabic. Rashi didn't know about the three-letter root system because he's living in Europe, not in the Middle East. He's not learning from Arab grammarians. So in fact, he got some etymologies of words wrong because he didn't know. And it doesn't mean he wasn't smart. He was smart, but he just didn't know what other scholars were doing at the same time period. And again, for some people, that would be, haram. It would be heresy. You can't say that Rashi didn't know. But from our perspective, Rashi's a person. So if Rashi doesn't know, Rashi doesn't know. Yeah, Mike.
So, the common saying is the victors write the history. I'm kind of wondering how that overlays on the history you just laid out in terms of what we know, what we remember, what's been recorded.
That's right. I mean, in many cases, we're captive to the sources. We don't have the Canaanite version of the conflict between the Canaanites and the Israelites. We have some Canaanite texts, but not, a point counterpoint thing. Sometimes, honestly, it's a little bit like learning about what the Democratic Party stands for by reading the Republican Party website. There'll be some kernels of truth there, and there'll be a lot of spin and occasionally flat out invention. And by the way, it'd be the same if you were reading the Democratic Party website to learn about the Republican Party's perspective. So we don't know what the polytheistic priests wanted, or what the prophets who said, everything's fine, don't worry, the king is wonderful, everything's going to be great. We don't have those prophets because they didn't save those. So, we're captive to whatever sources we can find and have dug up and can interpret from the sources. So you're right, the winners write the history books on some extent, but they don't always get to decide which books get kept. You see, that's one of the interesting things about Jewish history, is sometimes the people that wrote the books weren't around anymore when other people were deciding what books to keep and what books to get rid of, or how to order them. So the rabbis decide what was in the Hebrew Bible and what was out. And they left a lot of books out that otherwise were common in Jewish communities of the era. You look at the library of the Dead Sea Scrolls community in Qumran, and you realize there's a lot more Jewish books circulating than just what made it into the Hebrew Bible, what the rabbis decided were in. So it matters who gets to decide what's in, and almost as important, perhaps even more important, it's not just what books are in, it's what do they mean. The Supreme Court is really important because it gets to tell you what the Constitution means. They can't amend it, but they can tell you what it means. And so if they decide a well-regulated militia means any Yahoo with a no training and free concealed carry license with no permit, what are you going to do? They're the ones who get to decide what it means. So that's the other power that the rabbis had. They chose what books were in and what order and so on, when to read them, which ones to de-emphasize, but they also got to say what it means. And once you get to say what it means, then you can continue to change the narrative. So who are the winners? The winners in the story are the rabbis, not the priests. The priests wrote the Torah, but the rabbis got to tell you what it means. So they're the real winners.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I started reading the Jewish Bible that you recommended, and one of the essays is talking about how even within the Bible itself, they're reinterpreting earlier parts of the Bible, and then this continues in the Talmud. So my question is there a point where the Talmud has ceased to be written, or are people continuing to interpret?
Well, people still interpret it, but it's on a lower order. There's a concept of, it's called Yeridat HaDorot, the decline of the generations. So the earliest rabbis in the Mishnah are of a higher authoritative status, and then the later ones are of a lower status. And then the ones who are writing commentary on the side, you can't put a text in the middle, you have to write the commentary on the side. If you think of a traditional Torah page where you've got a main text and then the commentaries. And if you're a good enough commentator to make it on the side, wonderful. But you can't directly challenge the first one, the earliest rabbis, like head on. You can't just cancel it. You have to interpret around it, qualify it, but that kind of discussion, interpretation is still going on. They're still deciding questions of Jewish law. I mean, sometimes it's applying it to new circumstances, like is driving a car allowed on Shabbat? Is using an elevator allowed on Shabbat? They have to see where that fits in other categories. But they're still commenting on how to offer animal sacrifices and what the right way to do it is. There's just been a lot of commentary you have to go through to be able to make your own comment, to make sure no one else said it before. There's actually a wonderful academic culture of citation in rabbinic practice. I mean, it'd be familiar to you also from the Hadith, where it will say, so-and-so heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so. So just like in Muslim storytelling about Muhammad, in the Hadith tradition, in rabbinic literature, you also have Rabbi so-and-so heard it from Rabbi so-and-so going back, because the farther back you go, the older it is, the more authoritative it is. So people are still making Jewish law rulings, but they're not going to all of a sudden decide chickens don't count as meat for the meat and milk separation, even though that was debated in Talmudic times. In theory, you could go back and dig it up, but that was decided by people far more holy than we are. I remember my father once got in an argument with his brother. My father had left an Orthodox lifestyle and become a humanist, and his brother stayed in that Orthodox community. And he was visiting once, and they wanted to go for a walk on Shabbat, and it was raining, so my dad reached for an umbrella. And his brother said, "What are you doing? You can't use an umbrella on Shabbat." My dad said, "Why not?" His brother said, "Well, the rabbis have said it's like building a house." He said, "Do you think it's like building a house?" My uncle's response was, "Not for me to decide. The rabbis have made a decision." So that's the attitude when it comes to Talmud and commentary. I saw Aaron was trying to get in.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I guess when I was listening to you, your teachings, so in a lot of ways, very refreshing to hear kind of the honest approach of things. But I was thinking when you're talking, so many times, there's always this rationalization when something sounds bad that the Jewish people did or what's there. We're always trying to rationalize it because I guess it's scary to admit that it's not all that good. But on the other hand, over the years, whenever you realize that it's not true, and in your heart it's mythical, even though people are kind of making it sound true. It's always very, very difficult, for me personally, to listen to it and not be able to voice, because you really feel like a heretic, and that even if you're in a lecture or a talk, when people say, speak your mind, we're here all to talk and hear each other's opinions, you really realize quite, clearly that no, it's not really like that. I was in a Torah study class about a year ago with some really good friends of mine, and I voiced some thoughts and opinions when I talk about angels in a Torah study, and one of these guys I'd known forever, he goes, "Don't you believe in Hashem?" It just struck me. I was like, wow. And I didn't want to make a battle and all that at a friendly thing, but it's interesting.
Well, this is that again, that re-education. People think Judaism is all about questions. You can ask any questions. There are no forbidden questions. There are definitely some questions that are beyond the boundaries of what you're allowed to do. I mean, just to cite a somewhat funny example, there was a rabbi in the Talmud who was thrown out of the house of study because they were debating at what point is a chicken considered lost for the ruling of returning of lost property. So they finally decided the chicken is lost. If it's within 50 cubits of the house, it's not lost. If it's beyond 50 cubits, it's considered lost. And the rabbi said, well, what if it has 1 foot on one side of the 50 cubit line and what if the other? And they threw him out of the house of study. Because sometimes you got to have a standard, right? Enough. But again, he asked a question that was too much and they got rid of him. So yeah, I mean, there are certainly questions that are too far or statements that are too challenging. And, we're a home for people who've been thrown out of the house of study, I guess, or at least we're willing to ask those questions that maybe are not as welcome elsewhere.
Can you explain what the Talmud is? Then
Sure.
Well, and also like the Jewish Bible versus the Torah.
These are all topics we're going to get into as we go through the class. So I can't give you the glossary like at the beginning. There's also this wonderful thing called Wikipedia, which is a nice starting point. Yeah, we will be getting into the evolution of the Bible and the Hebrew versus the Christian Bible and all that stuff as we go along. So sometimes I'll answer it, but in a bit. Yeah, Elliot.
So the historical record, the actual historical record that we know of was found in what year? And it was the Dead Sea Scrolls, I presume, or something like that.
Well, when you say the historical record, you're acting like there's one book that like is the master book of history. When it comes to archaeology, it's debatable. It's debated. You find a building and you find a piece of pottery and you do carbon dating on it and you get a date.
But I'm thinking, wait. What I'm thinking of is the written record that we can rely on that probably is real, not the dating. But so say we find the Dead Sea Scrolls from the year 1000 BCE.
Not quite. It's more like around the year like 200 BCE and forward.
Okay. So can we assume that from 200 BCE from these records, that's probable historical accuracy?
No. Well, like for example, it says in rabbinic literature, Rabbi Hillel said so-and-so. We don't have any other source for Rabbi Hillel existing than the Talmud. So they could have made up Rabbi Hillel and they could have made them all up. We don't know. We don't have any tax records. We don't have any driver's licenses or phone books or outside corroboration for the existence of these people. Now, it seems plausible that they existed, or it's sort of like, is Shakespeare Shakespeare, or is Shakespeare someone else who claimed to be Shakespeare, but it's still one person? Like, who cares? Might as well call it Shakespeare.
Right.
The Dead Sea Scrolls community, there's debate even over that, because what we have is a library and an archaeological site. But we don't have a history the way we would want history. I mean, look at how people are arguing over the Civil War and the Reconstruction period in American history, or the Revolutionary War and what the goal of the Constitution was. And that's within 300 years, and we've got a voluminous written record of all that. Holocaust deniers are out there casting doubt on something that happened 70 years ago.
So history certainly is interpretable. And where does fact come in then? If your side versus my side look at the same fact?
Well, but maybe you have alternative facts.
Ah.
To use contemporary vocabulary.
Can I jump in just for a second on
Sure,
that?
Laurie, go
Because
ahead.
that's my discipline, of course.
Yeah.
The problem is that witnesses to history, I mean, take a battle, for example, if you read people who, the stuff that people were there that wrote, certainly some of it is, after the fact, they want to cover their butt or whatever, and they write things. But the fact is, you only see so much. The Battle of Agincourt is very interesting that way. The Battle of Agincourt occurred between the English and the French back in 11 or 12 something, 13 something, whatever. But there's 3 chronicles. And if you read the 3 chronicles, the 3 sources, they tell entirely different stories of where the archers were and who fired first and what the French were doing tactically. And there's no political aspect to it. And they're not trying to suggest that we were right or we were wrong. It's just, quite frankly, the witnesses and the information that these witnesses, wherever they got them from, wrote down things that this is what we knew, this is what we understood, even if you read more contemporary stuff like in Vietnam, different soldiers and officers and sides, it sounds like they're talking about different battles, sometimes. So it's a very complex thing, history, and how you put it together. And you take the most reasonable thing that you can do as a historian. But, Adam may look at the same set of stuff and come up with a different, fairly reasonable, valid argument saying something else occurred in a different way. And that's what makes horse races, as my mother used to say. But there is no truth. History is not truth. History is relative, because as we discover new things, like archaeologically, it changes how we look at some of these things, because we learn new things about what happened.
Well, and nobody sees the whole thing.
And nobody sees the whole
They
thing.
only see
Right?
parts of it.
I know that the major event is real. How the event is interpreted or seen by the various eyes is what differs. We know there was a civil war, and we know there was a battle between the French and the British. The details is where it gets a little sticky.
Often, but sometimes how you interpret the data is challenging. So let's say you have a burn layer on a city, okay? Like you have a layer of ashes, knocked down buildings, okay? Was that Mrs. O'Leary's cow, or was that a conquest by an outside power? Now, you might have arrowheads that would support an outside conquest, right? Or spears. You're probably not going to find a charred cow as part of the evidence. But, so they're always arguing over how you're going to understand what you find there. There's even debate. For a long time, scholars were convinced that David was a totally mythological character, that he didn't have a slingshot, he didn't hit Goliath, he didn't really exist, he was just invented by later generations. And then they found an inscription in the desert that from about 200 years after David supposedly lived that refers to Beit David, the house of David. Now, does it prove he was good with the slingshot? No. Does it suggest there was a David who was important enough to have a house named after him a couple centuries? Well, maybe. That gives a little more plausibility to it. It doesn't prove all the stories true, but the idea of some kind of house of David is suggestive. Now, there would be scholars who would argue that's really the house of the beloved, because David is written the same way the word Dod would be, which means beloved. So maybe it's a romantic text, or it's a house of the beloved goddess, or something like that. So you could even argue over what would seem to be a straightforward documentary source. So, this is the challenge. And this is why, by the way, our version of history is sometimes a lot less satisfying. because we don't have this happened this date and this happened here and this happened, that our brains like that. But the evidentiary approach to history doesn't produce that. And we have to sort of live with that indeterminacy of likely, maybe, most probably. That's the kind of vocabulary we have to get used to.
Adam, one of Rabbi Friedman's examples that I loved is something like that, where two of the Northern Hill communities, they found some tells, and the communities were living very similar lives, but one, they found a lot of swine bones, and the other tell there were no swine bones whatsoever. And from that, they were able to interpret kashrut law.
Well, they would claim one is a Jewish site and one is a non-Jewish site. But of course, who says that those dietary laws weren't written later? That's like a projecting back. Or maybe there were two communities, one followed, one didn't, and they argue with each other. That's also the Jewish tradition, is the argument back and forth. And maybe we'll start next time as a kind of review by looking at the discussion questions for this opening unit. And I'll just show you what they are so you can think about them all week long, and we'll pick it up with class the next session. All right, so the first one is, how do traditional approaches to discovering Jewish history differ from those of secular humanistic Jews, and which approach is supported by academia? With regard to biblical history, what might be the dangers of over-skepticism toward the biblical account, and what are the dangers of under-skepticism? Why is the study of and connection with Jewish history a central practice for us? What are some of the practical consequences in Jewish life of this approach to Jewish history? For what period of Jewish history would revising the general understanding be hardest to accept, ancient or modern, and why? And before you automatically say ancient because of the Bible, think about it a bit. And number 6, how is a Jew or secular humanistic Jew studying Jewish history different from someone who doesn't identify as Jewish studying Jewish history? And is there a difference or not?